Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more. So stay tuned.
All right, so today I am joined by Jamyle Cannon, Executive Director and founder of the Bloc. Thanks for joining me.
I'm so excited to be here.
To kick it off, why don't you tell us a little bit about how your organization came to be?
Absolutely. So I moved to Chicago to help start a school on the west side. And as the first action to connect with young people in this brand new school, I decided I was going to be the basketball coach. It was the first sport that the kids had a chance to play. And I started the basketball tryouts with 70 kids, and I cut 58 of them immediately. And
how did that not break your heart?
You know, at the time, I'm thinking like I have a high bar, I have a high standard. That's my internal thinking about this. But then you recognize that kids are coming to me for a connection. They're coming to me because they want to be a part of something that I'm leading. Mm-hmm. They want to be with each other and better themselves, and they see this team as a way to do that. And I just told them no. And that did start to weigh on me. And I was a national champion boxer, and kids were telling me I should start a boxing club, and I didn't know how that made any sense, but they were persistent that this is what we want in this school. So I started a boxing club in my classroom with 12 kids. We had boxing lessons and just kind of hung out after school. I checked their grades at the end of the school year, and they had a 3.18 GPA. Thought that was pretty good. Let's do it again. We got bigger the next year, 20 kids. The same result, about a 3.1, 3.2 GPA. Grades were going up. Kids were happier. It changed their relationship with the school. So I decided, let's get a little bigger the next year. And we invited kids from around the community to show up, and 80 kids started coming to the program, and the school made us shut it down. There were too many kids coming to it for it to be an after-school program. It presented, in their mind, a safety and security risk. So I decided I was going to leave my job at the end of the school year to start a nonprofit, the Bloc. That year in 2017,
I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm like, that's wild. A safety and security risk,
yeah,
as opposed to having kids do what?
And you know, we think about the need for holistic resources for young people, the need to listen to the needs of people within the community. In my mind, that's what we were doing. Right. But I can't explain the decision making behind saying that we have too many kids that want to be here. To me, that is a function of a quality space for a school. We want schools to be resources for young people and communities. I think one of the things that happens within schools is there's competition between schools when there should be cooperation. So when we have 80 kids coming from different schools to be a part of this program, there's no school that gets to say that we are the owner of these results. The competition for people, the competition for results, I think that may play a part in it, and that these aren't our kids, when in reality, I'm looking at all kids as our kids. This is our city. So I left my job at the end of that year, started the Bloc. We worked with 120 young people that year, and we started realizing that there were needs that weren't being met outside of the sport of boxing, outside of recreation. So we started an academics program. We started taking kids on field trips. In 2020, we got a building. We started a food pantry in the height of the pandemic to make sure our neighbors had enough food to eat. A virtual learning lab, enrichment programming like photography and coding. Basically, we want to meet kids where they are. We want to be talking to kids who want to fight. And then we want to make sure they have all the resources and opportunities that kids deserve, but Westside kids are often denied.
There's a lot coming up for me right now, especially because, so I grew up in Chicago, right? And one of the things that I loved about Chicago was when I was growing up, there was a community. And one of the things that we used to do, the West Loop used to be very underdeveloped. And they would find warehouses that nobody was in, and we would throw parties there on the weekend.
That sounds like a time.
It was a great time. It was a great time. And it was from all over the city. And so that's why I'm like, to me, this is wild that we would shut down something that kids want that's in an adult supervised environment. And that's exactly what I think would keep them out of trouble, as opposed to some of the stuff I was doing.
And not only keep them out of trouble, but get them into good. When you talk about those memories, you know, the warehouse turning into a party, you're creating core memories of childhood.
Right.
That I think all kids deserve access to, and we are perfectly fine saying that some kids aren't going to get it. But the things that you just remember, you look forward to, the cutting up that you did with your friends, to do that in an environment that's supported by adults and that's loved by the community, that changes the way you feel growing up. And I think every kid needs that.
We used to also do these things. Here at Washington Library, everybody would congregate once it closed. There used to be a Burger King across the street. And I think it was a Burger King. It was something, but it was a parking lot. And I promise you, there were over 100 kids there. Kind of like what just happened in, what was it, Millennium Park?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we used to do. And it was Sunday evenings when the library closed. And it was just breaking battles, ciphers, like that sort of thing. And so folks were just having a really good time, and they let us do that.
Absolutely. And now it feels like anytime, particularly youth of color, are in the same place at one time, the feeling is we don't want them there.
Right.
Right. And then it becomes an act of subversion instead of an act of community. And when it becomes an act of subversion, then we see situations where unruliness breaks out, where violence can break out, because the intent of being there has to change because they're not wanted in those spaces. And if we make it clear that we love our young people, we want them in spaces, we invite them here, we thought about them beforehand, we can create more spaces where they can go and be themselves and have positive outcomes.
It's really interesting because it mirrors to me what's been happening with housing in Chicago, because all of these places that we used to hang out in were underdeveloped from a housing perspective. The West Loop had no folks in there. Like I said, it was warehouses. It had like maybe one restaurant. That part of downtown didn't have as many of those like really expensive condos. And so as folks with a ton of money move in, us who lived here, who've been here, have been getting pushed out, and then no other resources given. And
intentionally pushed out because having a bunch of young people of color hanging around a certain space may not be as conducive to your property's value rising as you want them to be.
Because obviously we're going to do something that they don't want us to do, right? That's the assumption. It can't be that we're just hanging out having fun.
And it's like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Almost. If we're going to treat a group of people as if bad things are going to happen, we're going to set up a society that is around that assumption. We almost guarantee bad things are going to happen.
Right. Yeah, because we leave no other option for folks, right? And if you think about it, if you look at Wrigleyville, it's all these white folks congregating, and nobody calls the cops and says, hey, there's 50 white people in front of my house. I'm concerned.
Right. There'd be constant calls. I was at the playground with my son, and I heard some parents talking about some 6th, 7th grade kids who were at the playground, talking about them as if they were bad or wrong or there to cause harm. And in reality, they were really just in a place that didn't make a whole lot of sense for them. They were in a place that wasn't built for them. And because they're in a place on this playground that wasn't built for them, everything that they do seems out of place. Everything that they do seems wrong. And if we would just take a second and think, how do we build a space for these people to be that makes sense to them, so they're not, swinging off of monkey bars? Yeah. So they what do they call it? So they're not swinging off of monkey bars in front of toddlers. And we could just build a space that's made for them. Everything that they do then is going to become functional and good if we put them in a space that we've created for them. And we are not creating spaces for young people of color in the city of Chicago, and they are existing in places that weren't made for them, and everything that they do is being viewed as hostile, as violent, as dysfunctional, when really they just need a space.
Agreed. The space happened to be behind my house this weekend.
Yeah, what you got going on?
A bunch of people parked their cars behind my house, and I live on the west side, and they had music going. My partner was like, I want to go kick it. I'm like, we don't know, folks. We're going to bed. But that's what they did. It was behind my house. It was just lined up. It was a closed street, and so they had brought out speakers and just were parked out there chit chatting, nothing major until about 4 or 5 in the morning.
My goodness.
Because folks need that, and it definitely, and so much has gone away. Because I think about some of those hangouts too, like the roller rinks and things like that we used to have that have also gone away, and so those spaces are being replaced by nonprofits, but then we're also under-resourced and not able to provide services to everybody, right?
And those spaces are often replaced by nonprofits that have a particular idea about what is wanted or needed by a community that isn't always informed by that community, right? If we're really going in and listening to communities and providing the things or helping to create the things that they're asking for, we're going to get a stronger outcome than if we descend on a community with a set of objectives and ideas that comes from somewhere else, because that somewhere else often isn't connected to the people of the community. So I really think it's important that in addition to, equitable funding, that we think about what it is our community wants, what is it that our community is really asking for within this space, so that we can provide it as opposed to bringing our own ideas into it. And that's something I'm particularly sensitive about because I'm not from Chicago. So I can't just show up and say that, I grew up in this experience and this is what's necessary. I have to listen in order to come up with anything that's worthwhile.
Also, though, if you are from Chicago, it still matters what part of Chicago you're from. You can't just come into new communities. We're we have very strong feelings about that.
And not only strong feelings, but completely different lived experiences from even one West Side community to the next. There are changes within
Yes. I want to go back to the thing about things being listening to the community, and I feel like some of it is not on the nonprofits, but the way funding is being done. Because if you look at a lot of government grants in particular, but even private philanthropy as well, they already dictate what the program should be like before you even apply. And so if you want, sometimes you're making the decision between cutting positions at your nonprofit, which are folks from the communities that are typically impacted, or modeling the program according to what the funder says, which may not be coming from the community, because funders go after evidence-based programming that's typically about 5 to 10 years behind whatever time they did the research study, right?
Absolutely. So a question that I have is, how do we change that dynamic, right? How do we change this dynamic of funder-driven programming going into communities? And it seems to be happening. I can only speak to my experience, but it seems to be happening to communities of color, to communities that have been historically disenfranchised, because people have ideas about what those communities can and should be. So how do we change this funder-driven nonprofit sector? I think one of the things that has to start happening, and maybe it's unfair to put the onus on the people being impacted, but I think one of the things that has to start happening is we do need to be clear about this dynamic. I think there are funders who actually don't know that they're imposing or haven't been told that they're imposing. And I think communicating this more clearly to the philanthropic landscape, that there are needs of the community that they haven't been hearing. If they do have a desire for community impact, that's a call that they will hear. Something that I've been really intentional about is giving feedback to funders when they're asking us to do something that is harmful or not aligned with our goals, is making sure that I'm saying that and I'm saying it clearly. And there are some people who just can't see it.
Yeah.
Just like some people who just can't see it. But I'm finding that there is room for discussion within these conversations. There's room for discussions within our dynamic that I think we need to maximize so that we need to make this field better for the people who come after us.
I think, and I talked to you a little bit about this before, I think there's been a lot of progress, because I think as recently as like 6 or 7 years, we couldn't have these conversations with funders. We had an experience, this is funny, where somebody reached out to us and they were like, we would love to fund your programming. We just need you to drop any reference of restorative justice from your language. We're like, no, we're not.
We don't fund you, but don't be who you are.
Exactly. And they're like, our board is not ready to receive this kind of language. And I'm like, that is like the most PC language in my opinion, right? And we obviously said no. And so I think philanthropy has done this thing of recognizing there's an issue where they're hiring folks with more understanding to have these conversations with the nonprofits, but they're not trickling up to their board because these foundations were not set up to actually make social impact.
Yeah, that's the truth. And when we talk about like hiring people who have a greater understanding of what's happening on the ground, one of the things that's happening is they view themselves as a buffer between the nonprofit and the board, when I think they should view themselves more as translators and people who are going to impact the board, impact their understanding, to help bring them along closer to where they are in their own understanding. Because if we only end up with buffers and nobody's doing the change on the other side and making the pushes on the other side of that conversation, then we are functionally going to be in the same place that we were before. It's great that we have these staff people on the board, on the people on the staff of funders that can change the conversation for us. But we need people on these staffs to start changing mindsets as well. They have access.
I feel like some of them do try to do that, and it brings me to the larger thing that's going on in the U.S. right now, where there's this like backlash against these types of initiatives because folks don't want to take accountability because it feels uncomfortable to be like, hey, I'm part of the problem. And so I wonder how long it would take for that change, because I feel like philanthropy, the landscape has really been changing in the last 5 years. So how long will it take for their boards to catch up with those changes is the question. Not rhetorical one, not one for you to answer, because you just looked at me like, nah. But that actually brings me to something that you've been doing, right? You've been really active on social media, trying to be really outspoken about these issues. How did that come about?
Really what I'm doing is trying to take conversations that I have been having behind closed doors and also conversations that I've been having with funders and broaden them out, because I think there is an audience for changing the philanthropic landscape. Even amongst philanthropists, I think there's an audience for a lot of these messages. They may not agree 100% with what I say, but they understand that some progress needs to be made, particularly along the lines of racial equity and listening to the people on the ground. So I recognize that there was a need to spread this message beyond the people that I had immediate access to, and I just started saying things online about what I had seen in the philanthropic landscape, what I had experienced as a Black leader within this sector, and what I think needs to be happening so that our world is better, so that the sector is stronger and is actually working to solve complex issues as opposed to placate them, and working to listen to leaders on the ground as opposed to control them.
If you're enjoying this episode, we have a few upcoming events that will be perfect for you. Join Alternatives and Broken Office Chair on October 5th at Chicago United for Equity for our second Cocktails and Complicity event. Guest speakers Ayoka Samuels and Leslie Honore from Broken Office Chair Season 1 will join Bessie in discussing the complex dynamics that perpetuate inequality in the nonprofit sector, such as being a woman of color in nonprofit leadership, the nonprofit industrial complex, the intersection of capitalism and philanthropy, and much more. Come enjoy a cocktail, network with nonprofit friends, and engage in these much-needed conversations. The link to RSVP will be in the show's notes. Have you been personally impacted by a toxic nonprofit? Do you have a nonprofit horror story that you're dying to share? We're right here with you. Join Alternatives for an in-person open mic night where nonprofit friends can gather and share horror stories about navigating the nonprofit industrial complex. Come prepared with your favorite story, poem, or song about the terrors of funder site visits, annual appeals, audits, and more. We invite you to share a drink with colleagues and revel in the joys of nonprofit life. The link to RSVP will be in the show notes.
I want to zone in on something that you said, your experience as a Black leader. And I think that's really important because one of the things that we try to highlight, all those stats show that even though folks of color are the majority of our staff, the leadership is still disproportionately white, And so one of the things I would like to see is more exposure around the experiences of leaders of color. And so can you talk about what you've experienced as a Black leader?
I think I have had an overwhelmingly positive experience within my realm because of a level of connection that I can have with Black people and people of color that I hope my organization intersects with. I think it has allowed me to have a perspective on the work that centers the people that we love and care about. It allows me to approach this work every day with a palpable love for the people that we're impacting, and an understanding of how these external structures can impact the way that they live their day to day. I'm a Black kid from Kentucky, and recognizing how the education system, the medical system, the food system, the political system sometimes felt pointed at me as opposed to in support of me. So really having empathy from that perspective, I think, has given me an advantage within this field to make the impact that we're looking to make. Doesn't mean that it doesn't come with challenges. Black leaders get less unrestricted funding than other leaders. We are recognized as being closer to the ground of the issues that funders say they care about, but we're not trusted to execute the missions that funders say they care about at the same level. And I don't want that to be the case for the leaders that come after me to the same extent that it was the case for me. I walked into an industry that it felt like people were bending over backwards to be what funders wanted them to be, as opposed to being themselves, because that was what was going to be best for their community. So I felt a responsibility to speak on that and to actually try to help funders understand and move forward in ways that were going to help them in their impact to communities. I have been privileged to connect with funders who really want to better themselves in the way that they do their work. I've been privileged to be supported by Black philanthropists like Liz and Don Thompson, who gave our organization $1 million because they recognized the need to fund Black leaders in the education realm. So I think being a Black leader puts us in a particular position of impact, both on the community level and on the philanthropic system level, where we can speak with authenticity to both groups in a way that's going to move our missions forward.
I really think that you've benefited from, which is a really weird thing to say, from not having grown through the nonprofit system. You just came in and did your own thing. Because what I've experienced from folks is so much trauma, and you basically learn to be quiet over time because of the impact it has on your programming when you speak up and you piss off the wrong funder. And we actually had a situation where we advocated for programming during the pandemic and thought the funder was approaching it really wrong, and they yanked their money. Mm-hmm. Lucky for us, it wasn't like a huge impact, but it was large enough where for some other organizations it would have had huge impact. And so have you talked to folks about what their experience has been in the nonprofit and how that keeps them from speaking up?
The experience that I hear is racial trauma.
Yeah.
Right. It's racialized trauma within a particular power dynamic. But that translates across all fields, right? Mm-hmm. That translates into the corporate world. I started off in education, had the same racial power dynamics in education, to the nonprofit field, to sports. Like in every realm, there is a level of racial trauma and power dynamics that people have to navigate. So the racialized trauma of the nonprofit sector is real. It is something that people should not experience. And it impacts the way that we believe in the power of our own voices. It's something that I encountered for the first time within the sector when I was actually out of town. I was at a conference. I was shared a taxi with a man, and we were coming from the same speech, and he was asking about the work, and there was a story that I had told that I decided this moment I was going to stop telling it because I was telling the story of a young man who I was going to pick him up on a Saturday morning. His whole block was taped off with police tape, and when he came out to my car, he told me there had been a shootout in his alley the day that morning, and he looked out the window and he saw his friend had been shot, and he realized that had he not known that I was coming to pick him up later that day, he might have gone out there with him. And in my mind, this is a story of one, like there's a lot of trauma this young man is grappling with and trying to make good decisions, but also all he needed was an option, right? All he needed was an option of something like positive for himself to do that was gonna help him make a stronger decision. And it's a sad story, but I look in this man's eyes and he's thrilled. It's like he's watching a movie, and I didn't know what to do with that. And then he wants me to go tell this story to other people, and I'm at these are people who like they can write a check for my budget and it's not an accounting error for them. Like it's nothing to them. Mm-hmm. And I'm having to make a decision as to like, is this the relationship that I want to set up? And I ended up not giving him any feedback, but also not going to that next meeting because I didn't know how to handle that situation. But the decision that you have to make between speaking to people in a way that is affirming to your community and getting funded is, I think, one that is constant and real, and one that is particularly colored by the racial history and racial present of the country we're living in.
It's a very intentional choice for us to not tell those types of stories. Trauma porn, that's the term for it. I was teaching for a little while, and I was bringing one of our program participants with me because he was interested. It was a graduate level program, and so he was coming to class with me and participating, and they told on him. The students told on him, and so I was asked to stop bringing him to class with me, and I asked him for permission to tell his story because he was formerly homeless and was thinking about going back to school and really turning his life around. So I went back and told the story to the students, and I was like, he was here to see if this is the next step that he wanted to take. And their response was, well, why didn't you tell us? It would have been okay for him to be here. And I'm like, why do I have to expose his trauma for you to accept that, for you to decide it's acceptable for him to be in your space? When you can feel bad for him, it's okay for him to be in your space. But for him to enter your space as an equal, that was not acceptable to you.
Absolutely. And the relationship that we get set up with when we're constantly using those stories is one where people, again, they feel bad, they feel pity, and they give. And when you pity someone, you don't necessarily want the same thing for them as if you love them.
Right.
You don't want the same thing for kids that you're supporting because they're poor or because they're traumatized that you want for people that you support because you love them. And one of the questions that you had asked me was, when was the first time I got my heart broken? Having that realization and then continuing in the conference, having discussions with other leaders about this very weird thing that I felt. It's the first time I'd ever felt it. Mm-hmm. And getting agreement from other leaders and then watching them go on stage and continue to do that thing was one of the first times I had my heart broken, because I'm realizing they know what it is that they're doing. They know that this is trauma porn. They know that they're setting up a power dynamic right now as they're speaking. I know they know this because they've expressed this to me in the conversations that we've had, and they got on stage and did it anyway. And I understand that there is a way that things are done in the nonprofit realm, but to me, I think what hurt the most about it was recognizing that they weren't playing the game to change the game, but they were playing the game to win. Mm-hmm. They wanted to win in this deeply racist game and leave it in the same state for me and everybody else that came after. And I think that to me was the lack of understanding of the need to change this dynamic and their role within it. Because I would rather lose. I would rather lose.
Lose the battle, win the war.
Define the battle and the war on this one.
And this one, lose the battle would be you may not get that funder, but you're doing more towards education, towards the long game and the long strategy, right? Because we do the same thing. Because imagine if all of us decided to stop doing trauma porn. Funders would have to think of a different way to feel good and decide who they want to give dollars to. But as long as folks are participating in this game, there's no incentive for folks to change.
Absolutely. So on the one end, where I understand that people are traumatized by this realm, I think there are understandings that we have to have. There are reckonings that we need to have internally to say, like, there are some things that we're not going to play along with, and really stand firm in those and know who we are as people of color within the sector. And I to see that constantly bucked, to see that go out of the window so often so that people can get that next check is something that I am finding myself having decreasing patience for.
The first time you get your heart broken, right? We were chatting about that, and I think one of the things that's also interesting for me is that I think folks of color carry their same survival instinct into this workplace. And it plays out in different ways, because I think I mentioned to you that my story was that when I finally got to see, like, peek behind the curtain and see the decision makers and those folks that look like us that finally got to the table, they were making the same decisions and using the same language that we were advocating against. And I think what it came down to is that it took so much work and sacrifice to get to that table that they didn't want to lose that seat. But for me, I'm like, what's the point in you having that seat if you're not going to do anything with it, right? And so I love to challenge, when I was working as a teacher, challenge my students, or as an ED, like, what are your values? Because they will be challenged in this line of work. And I feel like the more that you move up and the more exposure you get and the more people you talk to, the more they will be challenged. And what is the thing that's going to allow you to sleep at night?
Another thing you said during that time was to decide those values before they're challenged. Decide those values before it comes up. And I think that's such a powerful necessity. That really made me think about what are the values that I'm going to stand on no matter what. What will I accept and what will I not? Understanding that before the situation presents itself is huge, and I wonder how much of that thinking people have done before coming into this realm. You know, what check will you not accept? What check will you send back? What will you not do for money, for publicity, for an introduction? What are the things that, what are your non-negotiables for yourself and your organization?
I think what's also really hard, and we had this conversation when we decided to roll out policy and advocacy as a department for our organization, and one of the first stances that we took was defund police. And we had a board member resign. We had to get different people involved on board with it, right? One of the things is that it's easy for me to turn down a check, publicity or ego or whatever those things, but sometimes those decisions mean that you have to, how does it impact that program? How many kids are you not serving because of it? And so the conversation we had was like, we didn't know how folks would receive our defund police platform, right? So what if it means people stop funding us and we have to shut down? And I remember one of my board members said to me when we decided to go in this direction, he was like, what you're doing can get you guys shut down, and it is still the right thing to do. And so we had the support of our board, which I think a lot of people do not, to continue to move in this direction. And obviously we were scared, but what has happened since we've done that is we've actually grown. And we didn't realize so many folks would be ready to get those messages. We just had to try.
I think people don't realize that there were a lot of wonderful people in this realm, and you had to be speaking to them, and you got more support, and you came out stronger because of it, because you're walking in the direction of your values with conviction. Mm-hmm. And when you walk in the direction of your values with conviction, you find other people who are going to do that same thing with you. And we have this, like, people want to be so politically correct and soft on their phrasing of things because they don't want to piss anybody off. But the fact of the matter is, when you put your flag in the ground, people see what you stand for, and they're going to gravitate towards that. And I want more people to realize that.
And I want people to make that hard decision, like decisive, not like, oh, this kind of feels good. Let me try this out, put my foot over here, and figure out. No, I want you to decide, like, draw that hard line.
Who are you?
Who are you? And is this the thing that you're standing for, right? It makes me think of, like, when those little Black social media squares in terms of Black Lives Matters were happening after George Floyd was killed. It was really easy for folks to post on social media, but they were not having the difficult conversations. They were not changing their practices. They were still supporting the same problematic politicians or the same problematic businesses. And so it's really easy to just, like, talk something theoretically, but when your actual decision making and your behavior has to change, that's when folks don't want to get aligned, right?
Yeah. And we had to do it out loud. We had to do it in public, in front of people, where it really matters. The number of conversations that I've had behind closed doors with other leaders and then walked out and seen something completely different has been astounding to me. So really deciding who we are and being that, because people are going to show up to be with you. People are going to show up to support you as long as you're being clear about who you are.
I feel like this podcast is also a really good example of that. We decided to do it, and folks are showing up and speaking their truth, and I'm loving it.
It reminds me of, so I lived in Phoenix, Arizona for a couple of years, and I don't know what it was about where I was living, but there was always like a car broken down on the side of the street, like somebody out there pushing. And I noticed, actually my car, my car was broken. I was padding the story for myself. So my car would break down a lot when I was living in Phoenix. And I know if I sat on the side of the road and like hoped that somebody would stop and help me push, it would never happen. But if I started pushing myself, like people would veer off to the side of the road and start helping me push. I think of the same way in terms of walking in your values. If you sit and you hope that people are going to agree with values that you haven't expressed and started walking in clearly, it's not going to happen. But when you get out and you start living it, you start doing the work to live with those values, people are going to show up and join along with you.
I joke about this a lot because I love my team and my board, and everybody's great. And we've taken so many chances over the last couple of years that I told them at one point, because I was getting really nervous about our growth, I felt like I made everybody swim into the deep, like jump into the deep water with me and then swim. And we're all just like, all right, cool, we're in the deep water. Now where do you go? What do we do? And everybody's just kind of trusting the process figure out that we're going to come out at the other end of it, right? Still in the deep water right now.
But it's easy to know that they know what hands they're in because they understand the values that we're acting within. They understand the lens through which we process things.
But the responsibility of that, how do you deal with that?
How do I deal with that?
Yeah.
I was hoping to get some tips from you. One of the things that I'm working on for myself is like speaking with clarity for everybody within the organization so that, things don't have to trickle up to me, but people understand with such clarity what is the best move that we could be making right now. How do we act within our values within any given moment? And how do we react to changing times? People can make that at every level of the organization. That's a push that I know I need to make as a leader. So it's something I'm figuring out myself, like how to handle that responsibility of being values-based, walking with a sense of purpose, and bringing other people along who are trusted in the mission. So anything you got for me?
No, I think for me, one of the biggest things is also like mentorship and like allowing others to have not just learn from my experiences, but also take part in those experiences with me as much as possible so I can get them that exposure and so that they don't get their heart broken, right? When they all of a sudden see what's behind the curtain, they can see it all along and learn those skills and that set them up for success. And just having really honest conversations. We kicked off a leadership pipeline a couple of years ago, and because when I took over, my organization is predominantly white, and now we're predominantly Black and brown. And so we have a responsibility to our folks to develop them and to give them the skills to be informed decision makers. And when I talk about informed is who are the parties that have the opportunity to make decisions about you and how do you interact with those parties as well, right? And one of the things I talked about with them is that the truth of the matter is this job is just going to be so much harder for you. It just is. You're going to have to be more credentialed. You're going to have to be more experienced. You're going to have to be more well-spoken, because we try to shelter them against all of those things. But when I put you in front of a funder, there's no more sheltering, right? And no matter how much I like to think that attire and presentation and all these things don't matter, they do when you get in front of certain people, right? And so you have to know that that's the case, and you can decide whether you want to play the game or not, but you need to know that that's going to be weighed against you.
Yeah.
And so really just kind of walking them through, for me, the responsibility is trying to make sure that there's as many seats for folks on the table as possible, and also trying to give them the skill set to use that seat wisely and not just do what has happened before we got here.
I love what you said about understanding that it's a part of the game. Like, when people don't know all the aspects of the game that they're playing, or that it's even a game, right? When it comes to what am I wearing, how am I talking, how am I presenting myself, those are things that is perfectly fine to ignore and show up completely authentically as yourself. You should understand, right? You should understand that how you're going to be read by other people. It's unfair, and we need to change that. But don't go into it blind, not understanding the
Ramifications.
all the ramifications of it. We need to work urgently so that is not the case. I want to center people who act, speak, dress outside of the norm, outside of the quote unquote norm, so that others can see that they are just as, or if not more capable as everyone else who conforms to these standards that got made up without us in mind, period. But know what the game is that you're playing. That's a tough thing for me to say out loud.
Yeah, and because that you have to know what it is to decide how you are going to participate, if you want to participate, right? And so I feel like that's a lot of the stuff I had to learn on the ground. I had to learn once folks didn't like me, once folks didn't think I was capable, and things like that. Once folks started reading me a certain way that I didn't mean to come across. And so I am just more transparent about that now.
And it's wild, because when you think about, nobody would expect Mark Zuckerberg to show up in a suit.
Right.
Like these or even a tech startup bro.
Yeah.
There are expectations that are placed on us as leaders of color, that aren't placed on anybody else. And people don't even realize. It's like they don't even know that it's nonsense. That a suit doesn't mean you're smart. That standard English doesn't mean you're smart. That these things all put together only show a proximity to whiteness, and they don't show actual competence and ability to get a job done. That's something I've been speaking about online a little bit more, and I find I get no more vitriol than when I'm talking about standard English grammar or the standards of professionalism that don't actually have anything to do with performance, because people hold so tightly to those because they believe if they just do these things, then they'll have a better shot.
The other side of it that folks don't talk about as much is that, so I've always just shown up to work in sweatpants. I feel like I can't think if I'm in proper clothes, and I'm more effective if I'm comfortable. And I actually had a young Latina tell me that I was disappointing to her, because there weren't a lot of Latinas in leadership that she has seen, and she just expected that me being in a leadership position would show up better as a better role model for people than how I was showing up in my sweatpants. And so another piece that people don't even think about is that sometimes it's not even coming from the white folks or the funders. It's coming from, because we all have that ingrained idea of what this professionalism or success looks like. And I've encountered it many times since then from folks of color, but that was the first time that it really stood out.
I had to unlearn it myself. And I think it was living on the West Side, working with West Side youth, that really made me realize that they don't talk. What they're saying ain't wrong. It's just different. It's just different from what I grew up with, and this kid is just as smart as I am, or as I was when I was their age. They're gonna dress differently. They're gonna speak differently, and it has absolutely nothing to do with their ability to write code,
right,
or their ability to decipher. And I can understand them just fine. And when I started recognizing people doing things like correcting grammar that they understood perfectly well. Right. Correcting forms of B when I already understand what it is you're saying, probably better because you said it the way you did than had you used standard English. I realize that these are purely cultural bits that have nothing to do with being understood, and everything to do with conforming to the standards that were set up in order to show that we didn't belong there in the first place.
One of the things I wanted to go back to is that you talked about the racial trauma being across everything, and that just brought it up for me. And I think one of the reasons that nonprofit hits so hard is because you expect it to be different. This is supposed to be about community and helping others, and you just expect it to be different. And that's why we talk quite a bit about heartbreak and nonprofit, because you have this idealistic relationship with it until you get exposed to it.
I kind of agree with that. I can't say that I'm ever surprised by racism, whether it's overt or systemic or covert or microaggressions, because it's like, why would we expect? At what point should we have come to expect a fish to know they're wet? When we are a sector that has been dictated by predominantly wealthy white folks, there has never been a reason for them to turn a mirror on their own practices, because they're the controlling interest of the sector. And there hasn't been an interest in folks to tell them things because of the negative ramifications that could come from that. So we're asking a fish to know that they're wet when we expect things to be different within the nonprofit realm. I think, coming from Kentucky, coming through education and working a little bit in the legal system before becoming a teacher, started. I guess I expect things to be bad.
We all get a little jaded over time.
but not bad in a way that they're never going to get better.
Yeah.
Right? I expect things to get better. I know, and I believe I can make things better. Maybe I'm foolish in that sense.
I always say you can't do this work without hope.
Yeah, and some hope is naivety, but but I believe that this is a sector that can get better. If we make things better, if we decide who we are before that time comes, decide what our values are and stand on them and communicate those clearly. I don't think that we're forever stuck in this shitty realm as it is right now. I think that there are steps that are being taken that are going to continue and accelerate. That are going to make this a more equitable space for all of us.
On that note, what takeaways would you want folks to have?
I'd hate to just steal the one you gave me, but that's how I'm feeling right now. It really struck my spirit when you said, determine your values, determine your values ahead of time before you end up in that situation. I think also believe in the potential for change, even from people that you don't necessarily relate to. When we talk about funders, when we talk about the larger organizations that are making decisions about our community, really believe in the humanity of them as well, to make the changes that we know need to be made on our level. Believe in their intention, believe that they want your community to be stronger in the ways that you hope that they are, and communicate with them from that perspective. When I'm talking to you, as if I expect you to love our community, and I have feedback to give to you that is going to require you to change something fundamental about what it is that you're doing. I need to do so from an angle of belief. I need to do so from a place of love that is going to move the ball forward so that my community can be stronger.
All right. So where can you be found online?
All right. So if you're interested in the organization, go to the blocchicago.org. That's the BLOC, Chicago.org. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram at Jamyle Cannon. Hit me up on LinkedIn as well, Jamyle Cannon. I think that's all.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, this is a great time. Thanks for having me.
To keep up with everything going on at Alternatives or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. It's produced, researched, and edited by Catherine Best and Deanna Phillips. Thanks for listening.